Hello, everyone. Let's start. Thanks for coming for the roundtable on responsibility, rights, and virtue dialogues between East philosophy and Western traditions. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Liang Cai, a Chinese historian concentrate on the intellectual history and the political philosophy. This event was sponsored by History of Philosophy Forum and the Institute for Ethics and Common Good, Kellogg Institute, Liu Institute for Asian and Asian Studies. So let me give first some introductions why we are here, want to have a dialogue. A dialogue between the East and the West concentrate on the concept about freedom and responsibility. We will start with speech given by Chinese intellectuals, leading intellectuals in the 1950s, Hu Shi. So would you please play the video?
40年来如一日，40年来不断地提倡这个人要自由，这个一个自由的国家不是一般奴才能够造成贡献，只有能够自由的人，爱自由如生命，爱自由如面包，爱自由比面包还重要，比生命还重要，只有这一种的人才可以造成一个自由的国家。
So let me translate the speech. Hu Shi went to Cornell for undergraduate studies in early 20th century, got his PhD in the philosophy at Columbia University. He was the leading scholars or the leading intellectuals of Chinese, the elite circle. His speech given in the 1950s says, basically, my translation is, humans need freedom. That a country of freedom cannot be successfully created by a group of slaves. Only free people, those who cherish their freedom as much as life itself and as deep as bread, those who believe freedom is more important than life and even bread, can create a country of freedom. I think it's because this kind of thought, right? We saw not Asian people migrated to United States like other immigrants migrated to United States because we are here for freedom. Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century also criticized Chinese tradition, especially Confucianism, because Confucianism only talk about the responsibilities and talk about the virtue. This thought, talk about responsibility and virtue might suffocate your humanity, individual freedom, and your creativities. So that they want to learn from the West, about the freedom and the individual rights. So in the 1992, when I was in college, so the American political scientist Francisco Fukuyama, in his famous book, The End of the History, argues that the rise of Western liberal democracy signified the end of history and the final form of human government. However, we are here in the 21st century. We have said if we live in a society only prioritize freedom and individual rights, can become dangerous, can polarize and getting divided, both internally and internationally. So our forum is also echoing with Notre Dame, 2024-2025 forum theme, what do we own each other? So we hope through the dialogues between the Eastern philosophies and Western philosophies, we could, inspire us, found some solutions, to bridge social divides and foster healings among sufferings, division, and injustice. It's my great honor to invite Professor Mike Puett from Harvard and Professor Meghan Sullivan at University of Notre Dame to have a dialogue. Both philosophies and also professors created fantastic, phenomenal courses on good life. So today they are going to have a conversation on good life with freedom and responsibility. Let's first welcome Professor Puett, our guest, to give his understanding from the Eastern tradition about responsibility and freedom. Let's welcome.
Great, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here at the History of Philosophy Forum at Notre Dame. My deep thanks to the sponsors. My tremendous thanks to Tsai Liang for organizing this. And Megan, it is wonderful to finally meet you. I've long been an admirer of your work, and I very much look forward to the discussion to come. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming here. So let me begin with a unsurprising place, which is the beginnings of liberal theory. Let's jump back to, say, 17th century in early modern Europe, where a very standard and increasingly common move was made. The argument was, let's go back to the state of nature and imagine a world in which individuals were battling over limited resources and, of course, destroying each other in the process, and ask what sorts of a world would they have devised in order to live well. The move, of course, was precisely to say, let us forget about the complexities of the world, the historical development of the world in which we're living, in that case in 17th century Europe, and let us imagine a world of simply sovereign individuals, and what would those sovereign individuals choose to accept as a legitimate form of governance and ethics, the implication being that the base is, again, sovereign individuals, and those sovereign individuals are choosing out of their own rational decision-making process to yield some of their sovereignty to build a world in which they can flourish as best as possible as sovereign individuals, even though that means giving up some of their sovereignty to accept some form of governance, and then the debate as to what form of governance should that be. So I begin with this to make a contrast. So similar arguments certainly have arisen repeatedly in China. They tended not to win the day. So let me give you the counter-arguments to this move. The counter-arguments go along the following lines. You do not want to think of the world as sovereign individuals freely choosing to build a world in some kind of ideal state that you then try as best as possible to create in the messy world that we are living in. The argument against this is we do live in a messy world, and that messy world consists of endless patterns of interaction. Those interactions define everything, including what we would call a sovereign individual. And if that is the case, your starting point, and therefore, of course, your ending point for any discussion of ethics needs to be different. So let me make this more concrete to give you a few of the arguments that arose in China. So, are we, at least at our ideal way of thinking, sovereign individuals? No, let me tell you what you are. You are messes. You are messes of energies. All of you, by the way, at birth were equally messes of energies. The classical Chinese tradition is very committed to this. We're all equally at birth the same, but the same meaning we're all messes of energies. We have energies that we, later, as I'll discuss, can define as emotions, desires, tendencies, dispositions, but we're just messes of these energies. And what happens to us very early on as messes is we start, interacting with other things. Most importantly, other messes. We'll call them human beings. And those messes are part of, yes, as we will see, whole contexts of other messes. And when we start interacting with those messes, it means we encounter other things, other messes, and the certain way those messes are playing out will drag out from us certain energies. Now again, that's very abstract, so let me be concrete. You're a child. You're a child lying in your crib, and someone walks in and smiles at you. You feel happy. In this way of thinking, you feel happy because that stimulus drags out from you an energy of happiness. Then someone yells at you. You're angry, meaning, you won't be surprised to hear at this point, that action drags out from you an energy of anger. Meaning, from a very young age, we are in danger of being purely passive vis-a-vis the world. But, according to the tradition that will become dominant, that's peanuts. The graver danger for us as human beings is that very early on, we start responding to the world by rote habit and pattern. So, continuing my example, someone else walks into the room that for whatever reason emotionally reminds you of the previous person who smiled at you. It literally could be the way they walk, the smell of their body, anything, but it will equally drag out from you an energy. And same thing, someone walking in innocently to pick up socks, but something about them reminds you emotionally of the person who yelled at you. It equally drags out from you an energy of anger. Meaning that you cease to respond to the world that you are really encountering. What you're responding to are habits and patterns of responses. In the first example, someone is smiling and someone is yelling. In my second examples, they're not. And the argument is, as we grow up, these habits and patterns come to completely define our relationships, our ways of seeing the world, and more importantly, failing to see the world, everything we do in the world. Those patterns, by the way, aren't just ours, because everyone is like this, and those patterns can become dominant in social formations. They can last, for us personally, an entire lifetime. They can be passed on generation by generation, and in social organizations, they can last centuries, if not longer. All of the things that we would call customs, habits in larger social worlds, begin to try to think of them, in this way of thought, as sets of interactional patterns that can completely and totally define our existence. Why do thinkers want to begin with this kind of a thought experiment? It's for the next step. Because if you were training yourself to think of the world as patterns, the next stage is you therefore need to realize most of those patterns are probably not really very good. How would you begin to realize this? Because those patterns, once they set in, they can become, number one, static, which is incredibly dangerous in itself. They can often, even when we think, oh, but this is a good set of patterns, they can create trajectories that will take us in incredibly dangerous directions without us even realizing them. And what you are being asked to do in these ways of thinking is train yourself, cultivate yourself, involving things that we tend nowadays to think of as very unhelpful, namely through rituals, because rituals force you to see the world in a different way. In China, these rituals will often involve role reversals, where you physically become a different person in the rituals, the goal of which is to train you to begin to sense how you are patterned, how our social world is patterned, and once you can begin to sense that, you can begin to sense what those patterns are, what directions they're taking us in, and the things you can do that can begin to alter them. Why? Getting to our larger question of today, would this be of relevance? Well, here's why. From this point of view, those moves made in 17th century European thinking, intentionally trying to say, forget about the world, forget about history, let's reduce everything to the base, which is sovereign individuals choosing amongst themselves how to properly live. From this point of view, sovereign individuals are patterns. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad set of patterns. Patterns can play out in all sorts of ways. Seasonal change is a pattern. Is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's seasonal change. We have to work with it. But patterns have directions when we are humans. This is relevant for many reasons, but I'll just make an obvious one. Imagine if America, in the 1990s, when they were developing the entire system that we have now come to call as neoliberalism, really trying to organize the world around sovereign individuals and endless competition with each other, a vision that should run the marketplace, the educational system, families, absolutely everything. even though people at the time truly thought this would lead to a better world in the way that was being defined. In other words, a more prosperous world in which ideally those who were best at this competition would rise to the top, so you'd have a meritocracy in that limited definition of who was better at winning in a competitive environment. Even for those who were thinking this way, imagine if there were a few people who were, well, trained in classical Chinese philosophy that would reframe all of that in terms of saying, what are the patterns playing out here? Not assuming there are sovereign individuals and then let's maximize them through a competition, but say, okay, sovereign individuals, that conception, in other words, is a set of patterns. And if they're patterns, how does it play out if we create a social formation around these sets of ideas? The view would be, we, of course, can create such a social world. The question is, what are the implications? And even for those who are supporting it, saying it will create the great meritocratic world where the best at the competition will rise to the top, hopefully people also would have realized, well, it's going to create problems too. It will create incredible problems of wealth inequality. It will create incredible problems of those who are not meritocratic in that sense, who are not playing the competitive game well, who will correctly see themselves as being left out of a system that ends up being self-replicating. And they would have realized you're going to create an incredible number of extraordinary dangers that will begin playing out. It is chilling when you go back to writings from the 1990s, how few of the critiques of the world that we were creating actually are dealing with these sorts of issues, even though you'd think in retrospect that would not have been terribly difficult to have imagined. So what should I even put it more strongly, should we be doing now? Well, from this point of view, returning to the heart of our questions for today, imagine we took these ideas seriously. In other words, imagine if each one of you were to try to rethink the lives you are living, down to the most mundane aspects of them, in terms of patterns, sensing the degree to which your patterns are defining your life, for ill or bad, but even if you think for good, what are those trajectories? Imagine if you're doing the exact same thing for the world around you and beginning to question the entire social world we are living in terms of these conflicts and tensions of patterns. Does this, returning to Liang Tsai's opening question, lead to a focus on virtue and responsibility? It absolutely does. But note, virtue and responsibility here takes on a powerful tenor. Responsibility means you are an inherent part of all of these patterns, which means if they're going to continue, you're a part of their continuation. If you want to change them, you have to work on concretely what would that mean to begin to alter them. And yes, the only way to do that is, from this point of view, through self-cultivation, training, education, gaining, as the tradition would call it, a sense of virtue, which they would mean in this very concrete sense of sensing these patterns and sensing how to rework the patterns to create better trajectories. You will never live in a world without patterns, but you can become ever more self-conscious of where those patterns are taking you, whereas if your starting point is the sovereign individual, it makes it incredibly difficult to see the world as patterns because arguably the single biggest pattern, certainly in the world we're living, becomes something you don't even begin to question because it is so taken for granted. So part of the power of this tradition is it's trying, and I would say with great forms of success, building a vision of ethics and an understanding of responsibility with a very concrete sense of exploring the world as patterns, seeing the world as patterns, training yourself to alter these patterns and rework these patterns, and the responsibility comes from the fact that, and it would be a fact from this point of view, you are an inherent part of the replication of those patterns, which means you are literally responsible, and therefore you must be training yourself to rework them and try to sense what might be better trajectories for whatever worlds we collectively, intentionally or not, are going to be creating with the patterns we will be developing over the next several years, decades of our lives. And since these can continue, perhaps centuries of those social formations to come. It's an extraordinary tradition. It is very counterintuitive, and yet there's a very powerful practical side of concretely what you would be doing to try to see this world and try to train yourself to be the sort of person who could begin working with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Michael. When we were first starting God and the Good Life 10 years ago here at Notre Dame, I was very inspired by Michael's book, The Path. Our mutual friend, Steve Angle, a great philosopher at Wesleyan, got me turned on to Michael's teaching and his work. And it's been a great inspiration for us here at Notre Dame. And that is, I think, perhaps unsurprising. I think in the tradition of virtue ethics, and for philosophers, contemporary philosophers who are very committed to this tradition, we oftentimes treat Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy as being these distant planets that are the subject of curiosity and of interest primarily for comparative purposes. But in virtue ethics, these are still very much live traditions that share quite a bit more in common than they do that separates us. And I think one of the most moving facts about world history for me as a philosopher is that there's this period from 600 to 300 BCE, which is, a snap of your fingers in world history, where philosophy as a discipline comes online. In the East, it happens in the Zhou dynasty with Confucius and his students. In the Jewish world, it happens with the wisdom literature and the books of Ecclesiastes and Job, and people asking for the first time really in recorded history of those religions, what it means to be a good person in relation to God and what it means to achieve holiness in relation to God. You see it with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama in India and his students about finally asking very difficult intellectual questions and spiritual questions about what it means to break free of the cycle of human suffering. And obviously you see it in the West very dramatically with the life and sudden death of Socrates in 399 BC. And philosophy as we know it, as a profession in the West, starts in virtue ethics and starts, frankly, in these questions of freedom and responsibility. And so I thought, as I was preparing my opening remarks today, I might just zero in and focus on this debate as we receive it in the West through Socrates, because I think his death in that particular moment really raises these profound questions within virtue ethics for me. So, a little bit of background. We got a lot of undergrads in the audience. I don't suppose you've already taken your philosophy course. Much of what we know about Socrates' philosophy comes from his student Plato. And Plato famously records Socrates' conversations with his friends and neighbors and students, and even the conversations he had during his famous trial. And that's how we receive Socrates' teaching. Socrates also maddeningly tells us that he doesn't have a philosophy, even though he's literally the founder of philosophy in the West, that he was practicing this method of questions, and in particular, he was very interested in questioning his fellow Athenians about whether or not they were in fact just, in fact good people, in fact understood anything about the good life. The Athenians were very, very proud of their early democracy. They were, a small city-state that was constantly dealing with civil wars and with wars with their neighbors. So they were a fragile but very proud democracy. I want you to start to think if any of this reminds you of our current circumstances. And Socrates did feel a very close affinity with his fellow Athenians. And for a while, he was celebrated as being this great teacher of questions, this great person who prompted enlightenment among his fellow Athenians. But it turned pretty quickly when folks realized that Socrates was asking the types of questions that would destabilize democratic consensus in Athens. If you're constantly have Socrates going around corrupting your young Athenian youth and getting them to question the government, to question whether or not Athenian policies are correct, to question whether or not their Athenian elders are teaching them the correct teachings about the good life, then eventually this gets pretty tedious when you need those same Athenian youth to get on board and vote for the cause or to be subject to the powers of the day in Athens. And so Socrates found himself in trouble for his teaching because people believed that he was starting to destabilize the Athenian democratic consensus. Socrates was famously put on trial. And we know about his trial again from his student Plato and a series of speeches that Socrates gave in defense of his commitment to philosophy and his way of life. And remember, philosophy as we know it did not exist then. So Socrates is also trying to explain to Athens what it is that they're witnessing, how to make sense of it and why it's valuable. And Socrates very famously during his trial, and it's recorded in Plato's Apology, gives this great speech on behalf of freedom of conscience, saying how important it is for somebody who's committed to what's good and what's true to be willing to follow their own personal conscience in that commitment and to not be subject to the arbitrary whims of the state or the arbitrary whims of those in power. He says, men of Athens, I love you, I honor you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And when I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet, and saying to him after my manner, you, my friend, are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens. Are you not ashamed of heaping up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and caring so little about wisdom and truth, and the greatest improvement of your soul, which you never seem to regard or heed at all? So this is one of Socrates' very famous speeches. He also tells us very famously in the Apology that the unexamined life is not even worth living. In this view, he seems to share something with Confucius, who told his students, a few centuries earlier, I got to check my math with Professor Puett, that the committed scholar, the person who's really on the path to sagehood, the path to goodness, will not seek to live at the expense of injuring their humaneness. They will even sacrifice their lives to preserve their humaneness complete. So there's always been at the core of virtue ethics in the East and West this sense of, what in the Western tradition we would call a freedom of conscience, but across these traditions we would feel like a good person has a commitment to something higher than themselves, the truth, goodness, their humaneness, and that's something that somebody should guard from external forces that might try to corrupt or degrade it. What's really important, I think, to note about Socrates' speech in the Apology is that he's not only committed to the truth. He references multiple times in just that little passage that I read how much he loves his fellow Athenians. He even starts it with, I'm doing this because I love you. Imagine he is in fact addressing the whole Athenian assembly. He says that he's practicing philosophy not because he has an abstract love for the truth, but because he loves his friends. And he's worried, in fact, that his friends' souls are degraded by the fact that they're not asking these really difficult questions about the good life. What's really interesting for philosophers and maddening, and the kind of thing you get in an ancient philosophy course as a writing prompt, is that Socrates famously is offered a bargain by the Athenian state. He's told he can stop practicing philosophy and he'll be fine. He can leave the city and do whatever he wants somewhere else, or he can die. And Socrates very famously chooses death over the earlier two options. And in the next dialogue that we get from Plato, we get Socrates talking to these same friends that he's very committed to about why he would choose death over continuing to live his philosophical way of life outside of his city, or just kind of toning down his philosophical way of life. And you get Socrates' very famous dialogue where he seems to indicate he has a very strong, almost Confucian idea about his responsibility to the state and to obey the state powers. And how this is reconciled with what Socrates says at his trial is one of the great mysteries of Western philosophy. But I thought I would share with you how Socrates tries to reason about what his obligations are to the state. He seems to be very, very committed to following state power. And one of the topics I'd love for us to address in the dialogue is to what extent Socrates or the position in Western philosophy makes sense and how it fits with how folks like Confucius would have thought about the same issue. So again, very briefly, if you haven't read the Crito, that's the name of this dialogue, where Socrates is in prison. He's got a pretty lax prison guard, and so his friends keep coming to visit him. If you've seen the very famous Death of Socrates portrait, you see there's basically having a party in his prison cell at his deathbed. There are a lot of people coming in and out and talking with him. His best friend Crito comes to talk to him, and Crito's basically begging him to escape and to just choose the flee option rather than the death option, because Socrates' friends really love him. And Socrates says he's not going to do it, and he pretends like he's having a dialogue with the entire state of Athens, with like the government of Athens, about why he's not going to leave. And so he has the government of Athens talking first, and he says, in the government's voice, "Tell us, Socrates, what are you about? Are you going about by an act of yours to try to overturn us, to try to overturn the laws in the whole state as far as in you lies? Is this what you really care about? Do you really care about overthrowing Athens? Do you imagine that a state can subsist and not be overthrown when the decisions of its law have no power but are set aside and are overthrown by individuals like you?" Socrates turns to his friend Crito and he says, "What would be our answer if the state asked this of us, to these and like words? Anyone, and especially a clever rhetorician, would have a good deal to urge about the evil of setting aside the law which requires a sentence to be carried out. And we might reply, yes, but the state has injured us and given us an unjust sentence." So Socrates tries out this idea of the state's corrupt. Athens is a terrible state. So why should I have to follow that if I'm a true philosopher, if I'm pursuing the good life? And then Socrates answers on behalf of Athens. He says, "Tell us what complaint you could possibly make against us which would justify you in attempting to destroy us. In the first place, did we not bring you into existence? Your father married your mother and by our aid begat you. Say whether you have any objection to urge against those of us who regulate marriage, who create the conditions by which somebody like Socrates could come to be raised in his family and become the person that he is." Socrates says, "I'd have nothing to say to that. You're right, Athens made it possible for me to exist in the first place." He again talks in the state of Athens' voice. He says, "What complaint would you have against those of us who regulate the system of nurturing and education of children in which you yourself were trained and developed? Were not the laws who have the charge of this right in commanding your father to train you in music and gymnastics, to educate you and to make you into the kind of person who could ask these questions?" And Socrates says, "That's right, I have nothing to say to that." "Well," and then he continues in the voice of the state, "then since you were brought into the world and nurtured and educated by us, can you deny in the first place that you are our child, as your fathers were before you? And if this is true, you are not on equal terms with us, nor can you think that you have a right to do to us what we are doing to you. Has a philosopher like you failed to discover that our country is more to be valued and higher and holier far than mother or father or any ancestor, and more to be regarded in the eyes of the gods and men of understanding? And if our country leads us to wounds or death in battle, thither we follow, and this is right. Neither may anyone yield or retreat or leave his rank, but whether in battle or in a court of law or any other place, he must do what his city and country order him, or he must change their view about what is just. And if he may do no violence to his father or mother, much less may he do violence to his country." And then, very famously, Socrates prefigures the social contract idea about what it is that we owe our government, where political obligations to our society, to our superiors, even originates. And again, he does it in the voice, he pretends Athens is a person that's talking to him. "Any of you who does not like us and this city, and who wants to go to a colony or to any other city, may go where he likes and may take his goods with him. But he who has experience of the manner in which we order justice and administer the state, he who's experienced what has been good about Athens in his development, and still remains, he has entered into an implied contract that he will do as we command him. And he who disobeys us, as we maintain, thrice wrong. First, because in disobeying us, he is disobeying his parents. Secondly, because we are the authors of his education. And thirdly, because he has made with us an agreement that he will duly obey our commands. And he neither obeys them nor convinces us that who dies neither obeys them nor convinces us that our commands are wrong. We give him only the alternative of obeying us or convincing us. And this is what he offers. And if Socrates can do neither, then Socrates should die." So one of the things I think that's really interesting about this speech, it's maddening for philosophers because Socrates literally like days ago was saying that you should follow the truth above all else and actively resisting Athens' intrusion on his freedom of conscience. And then when push comes to shove and he has the opportunity to leave, he says that he owes Athens everything about who he is. And that even though he realizes the Athenian government is gravely unjust, they're doing things that he believes are a complete violation of what it means to live a philosophical way of life, he should nevertheless subject himself to Athens, to the full fury of Athens, literally Athens putting him to death, because he believes if he could not successfully convince Athens to change his ways, he still has an obligation to his city. Many philosophers think that Socrates' ideas are deeply in tension. I think that these kinds of tensions come up quite a bit in the whole tradition of virtue ethics. But I think there's also a common theme among these dialogues that I think is one of the keys to starting to reconcile them, which is that in both speeches, Socrates talks about the origin of his teaching and his way of life as being firmly rooted in his love for others. His love for his friends, his love for Athens. He thinks of Athens the way he thinks of love for a parent or love for someone who educated him. Somehow freedom and responsibility for Socrates in these dialogues are both ultimately grounded in this sense of love that emanates and is the ground for his philosophical practice. But that just raises more difficult questions. What does it mean to think that love requires a certain way of life for us when we also realize that we live in deeply unjust structures? This will be a question for Greek virtue ethics. It's absolutely going to be a question for ancient and contemporary Confucian virtue ethics. There's a term in philosophy called non-ideal theory, which is basically like the kind of ethical code that you should follow when you realize you live in a deeply unethical system and people are not going to reciprocate it. Socrates might love Athens, but Athens might hate him back, or not be. Socrates might be committed to the love of justice, and Athens might be totally devoid of justice. What does it mean to follow the philosophical way of life in those frameworks? It's a tough question, and I think it also goes without saying that Socrates' problems with his democracy are also our own. I think it could probably be understood as the most fundamental philosophical challenge that there is in virtue ethics, which is trying to reconcile the good life with devotion to imperfect institutions that nevertheless form and habituate us. Institutions like democracy, institutions like the Catholic Church, institutions like our educational institutions that play a very vital role in our formation. To close it out, a tradition of philosophy, a practice in philosophy that I've been very interested in and I've been inspired by Professor Puett's work and others is thinking about philosophy, contemporary philosophy, as a form of applied tradition. We oftentimes teach people applied ethics, which is a method of critique using logical argument. You try to gather principles, and then you show that those principles are logically consistent or logically inconsistent. And then maybe if you're feeling really public-minded, you write an op-ed about abortion or about politics, and you try to convince people to follow your argument to a particular single conclusion. And that is one very, very important practice in ethics. But there's another very important practice in ethics that goes far deeper and I think is rooted in the work of figures like Confucius and figures like Socrates, which is what I might call applied tradition. And these are contemporary philosophers that love institutions and traditions. So they love the tradition of Confucian ethics. They love the tradition of Buddhism or Catholicism as a world religion. But they also realize that there are imperfections in that tradition. There are logical puzzles. There are areas where the tradition has not yet evolved to describe for us a coherent way of life in contemporary circumstances. And so we need philosophers to do that thinking about how we argue with the tradition, within the tradition, and how we nudge it the correct direction. And this can be a very dangerous task. Obviously, it was this kind of work that ultimately ended Socrates' life. But it's one that I think is very vital and important, and especially as we think about what it means to try to use our intellectual and ethical and spiritual lives to strengthen traditions that we might value, traditions like democracy. It might be the case that sometimes this work is very difficult, but it's work that actually this long 2,000-plus year tradition of philosophers gives us the sort of hope to take on with full energy. And thank you.
Talk. I prepared 4 questions for 2 philosophies, but I will combine them, then we'll give the rest of the time to the audiences. So I'm really inspired when Michael talked about the Pythons, right? Pythons would carry on by rituals. And Meghan talked about, you still have responsibility like Socrates. He feel the responsibility to the, Athens, the state, even he was, unjustly put death by the state. So my question is, for the pythons or the rituals, how do we know, right? That is the right pythons, right? Like, the pythons of filial piety, right? Filial piety is a virtue advocated by Confucianism. So Chinese intellectuals actually argue against it in early 20th century. So that's the reason my parents never teach me filial piety. I'm here. I'm not a filial daughter. I choose my freedom to pursue truth over my responsibility to my aged parents. I'm the single child, so I always struggled. So that python, is python there once was questioned by Chinese intellectuals. But how do you know, when we should challenge that python, when we should, follow, carry out that python? Let's go back to, the Megan's question about responsibility, right? Who defines responsibility, right? So especially I grew up in a society that, the government would define your responsibility. For example, during COVID, the whole, Chinese government defines the responsibility of each individual. So you have to lock yourself within your apartment, within your house. Don't go outside for almost 3 years, right? They define the responsibility and implement that. So I just wondering, to what extent we should accept that, responsibility defined by the government. If the government don't define the responsibility, who could, right, define the responsibility? Especially sometimes responsibility would kind of have contradiction with our pursuit of freedom. Okay.
Please.
This is a hard question. I'll share something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and this is maybe just, again, we're seeding topics for the discussion with the audience too, but Socrates, besides being like historically the kind of domino that falls and then starts philosophy as a profession in Athens and into the present day, he's also just this kind of like mythical hero for a lot of philosophers. He's channeled by a lot of philosophers, especially if they're standing up to change some institution that has a lot of power in their time. He comes up quite a bit in future philosophy. And one 20th century philosopher that references Socrates all the time that I think quite a bit about lately is Martin Luther King Jr. And King's writings about civil disobedience, and civil disobedience especially as it's going to be practiced in the US civil rights movement. But King talks about Socrates nonstop, like Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which he's writing with a 2-inch pencil on like napkins that his lawyers smuggled in. Half of that is some kind of reference or allusion to Socrates as somebody who encourages him to stand up against an unjust forces. And what King takes from Socrates is this kind of ritual or process that you must undergo personally before you're ready to try to stand up to an institution that you maybe has some claim of authority on you. He says you can't just like start marching. And he's angry actually that so many protesters are just immediately like going to march and going to protest. He says you have to go through this vital first step of self-examination. Like Socrates' protest began with this internal practice and habituation of self-examination and trying to figure out like where is my heart, where's my conscience on this? And King says same thing for civil rights protesters. Like you have to go through this first moment of making sure that you have the correct intentions, that you're aware of your philosophical goals, that you've had conversations with your close friends, realizing that you've got the right intentions that you're going to bring into this, and only then can you start to try to address what you think is the deep injustice in the institution that you might have some obligation to. And I think that there's something very important about that oftentimes gets overlooked in the way we now talk about political obligation, but it's an important aspect of virtue ethics that not only is important for understanding whether or not the social movement or social change you're trying to bring about is morally just, but also pragmatically, the civil rights movement was a tremendous success. We've seen many, many other social movements that have gone after big institutions and have completely fallen apart. And I think there's some dimension to Socrates and King and this tradition of really wanting to go through a period of philosophical introspection before you try to resist a feature of your institution or tradition that's maybe also important for its longevity and success. But that doesn't really answer the question of how you know whether your rituals are good or your cause is just. You're supposed to I think for king, you're supposed to just pray about it. Socrates is you have a lot of drunken conversations with your friends, and then you just kind of realize what the truth is. And there's a bit of magic in that first step of when philosophy reveals to you the justice of your cause.
And it is very similar in the Confucian tradition, first with the opening point that absolutely the focus is on cultivation, training, education. If I right now say the state is wrong and I'm going to stand against it, that's more likely to be based in sets of patterns, and probably pretty selfish, dangerous patterns that I have, not based upon any complex sensibility of how I'm helping those around me to rethink our patterns. So very much rooted in that same vision. And then, as you said, the same quandary emerges, which is, well, then how even thus, you're cultivating yourself, you're beginning to sense these patterns. How do you know when they're good patterns or bad patterns? The answer is, this is part of what I find the tradition fascinating, there are not inherently good or bad patterns. And so, and part of what's tough about this is even patterns that seem to be playing out incredibly well over time can take on a trajectory that are leading to implications that we'll fail to see. So let me give a concrete example from the tradition before I get back to the real issue at hand of when do you stand against a state regulation, et cetera. But here's a standard one that will come up in the tradition. So I mentioned the state of nature arguments, made in 17th century Europe. So a contrastive mode that's made in China is always about, you won't be surprised at this point to hear, patterns, how they work out historically, how people alter them. So in one of these, let's imagine in distant antiquity, humans existing in the equivalent of what in early modern Europe would be called a state of nature, except in these narratives, people are existing in patterns. And in those patterns, they are eating things that grow from the ground, and sometimes they live and sometimes they die because some of it's poisonous, and they're being eaten by animals, which are just patterns. Tigers have big teeth and they eat us and we're good meat, and those are just all patterns. Now, that's not an inherently bad set of patterns for the tigers. It's great patterns, but humans, for better or worse, and you'll see this is ambivalent, began to realize that no, they could begin altering these patterns so that they, the humans, could begin to thrive very much, although they didn't sense this at the time, at the expense of other creatures in the world. So they begin domesticating these things that are growing out of the ground, so more good ones come up for us. They start creating the equivalent of things which we don't have, but you can sharpen wood and create the equivalent, and we start killing the animals. And then other animals, we realize we can do what we're doing with the grains, and we can domesticate them for us. And the results of this is we create a whole set of patterns based upon the fact that these patterns that exist above us, the seasons, we can organize our activities with the domestication of grains and animals, a tearing down of forests, a killing of wild animals that we can't domesticate, into an entire agricultural cycle. Now, was this a good set of patterns we were developing? Well, at the time, and for much of human history, it seemed like a really, really good one. We moved from a very high death rate, at least according to these narratives, to dramatic increases of human livelihood. Then well before the modern period, people began realizing, this is the point of the narratives, suddenly the North China Plain has no more trees because it's been completely deforested because of this good pattern. And people begin realizing this is actually taking on an incredibly dangerous trajectory. We need to start growing trees again. We actually, it turns out some of these animals that we're killing are kind of not things that we should be killing. You get critiques saying, what if we take the point of view of the patterns of, take the point of view of animals, like train ourselves in rituals to see the world from the point of view of animals, to begin questioning this anthropocentric perspective. And obviously, right now in the midst of climate change, we need to do much the same. So I say all of this in answer to Liang's question to say, was that initial set of patterns when we create an agricultural cycle a good set of patterns or a bad set of patterns? it seemed to be really, really good at the time. And in historical retrospect, we could say from many perspectives, it was a wonderful pattern. It also had incredibly dangerous trajectories that we were failing to see until way too late. We absolutely could say the same thing about the industrial age. So, does this give an answer? Well, kind of yes, because the implication of these stories is always be aware that even something that seems to be clearly good probably has potentially dangerous trajectories. And so the goal of the self-cultivation is you're training yourself to see not just the obvious injustices, which are incredibly important, but then sensing, even for those, how do you alter them in ways that really do lead to better possible trajectories? And even the things that seem clearly good, well, there too you need to begin questioning them, because some of the seemingly good patterns we're falling into, even those we've consciously developed, may include dangers that we're not seeing. So there's no clear criteria of a good pattern or bad pattern. It's about trajectories, and you're training yourself how to change them and how to generate better worlds as we do so, without any clear guideline telling you how.
Thank you so much for the answer. It's basically, human beings have a self-reflection capacity, right? In Chinese philosophy, they said 良知, so you have that conscious. But we said artificial intelligence, maybe they could never be human. They maybe don't have the self-reflection capacity, right, to do that. But I do have one more question is, in the Chinese tradition, they have a philosophy, famous saying, so regarding the prosperity and decline of all under heaven, they talk about the whole world. So they said every individual bears responsibility. So I just, we are in this, we enjoy the prosperity of our age, but we definitely sense this danger is coming, right? What should we do? Could you give us some, insight, especially we have undergraduates here, a lot of undergraduates, so.
All right, you got to go first.
Sure, and I will speak in strong support for the quotation. We absolutely are responsible. This is one of the keys of the tradition I find so powerful coming out of China, is that all of the patterns that exist, we are a part of those patterns by definition. Even things that we think are horrible going on in the world, at some level, often unbeknownst to us, we are playing into those patterns. That's true of just, at our mundane lives, when we're dealing with a mean, selfish colleague, well, I'm doing something that's playing out into that pattern, and at a larger world of high social injustice, I'm also a part of those patterns, which means in a very literal sense, I am responsible for the continuation of those patterns, and therefore, more importantly, I'm responsible for trying to alter those patterns for the better. So we absolutely are, and looking particularly at the undergraduates, I would say if you take these ideas seriously, and I hope you will, take that as one of your life goals. Rethinking your life in terms of patterns, rethinking the social world in terms of patterns, trying to train yourself to see there is nothing natural about you. There's nothing natural about the social worlds you are living in. They are patterns. They consist of very dangerous patterns we don't see. They often, again, consist of what we would often, with plausibly good reason, see as really, really good patterns, which probably have incredible dangers. And your goal from this point of view is you are training yourself to see the world, see these patterns, begin sensing how to alter the patterns. They will often say you begin at a very mundane level, like the example I mentioned, how do you deal with a mean roommate or a mean colleague? Training yourself even with that kind of a pattern, you're learning how to sense these patterns, sense what you're doing that's playing into them, sense how to work with them, and that's the same work you're trying to bring to the larger social world. When you're dealing with incredible injustices in the world, how do you critique them? Because how you're critiquing them is going to create trajectories, and you want to train yourself to see you're moving things in ways that will lead to better worlds, which means you're training yourself to see, how do I do the critique? How do I begin to alter these patterns? How do I begin to see if I'm doing something that I think is good that's actually going in an incredibly dangerous direction for those around me? And you're training yourself to try to catch that. And it will be a lifelong process, but it's an extraordinary process because, going back to the quotation, we absolutely are responsible for all the patterns that exist because we're a part of them. And therefore, we're responsible for trying to change them and creating better patterns where those around us can truly, truly flourish.
I think I had not read that passage before Liang sent the questions, so I thought it was very provocative. And I think first I'd agree with Michael. I think one of the sources of nihilism in 21st century life is thinking like you're one single isolated individual, and then there's insert global phenomenon,
Yes.
and you have absolutely no causal efficacy whatsoever in making the leap from like your particular life to climate change, collapse of democratic institutions,
Yes.
Fill in the blank, antibiotic-resistant viruses that are going to come kill us. Like fill in whatever the news story is that you're reading. You think like, well, there's absolutely nothing I can do as an individual voter, antibiotic user, recycler, or whatever that could possibly make a difference to that large systemic phenomenon because there's just this huge gap. There's just me and that whole big thing out there. But one of the upshots, I think, of the view of the world that we get from these virtue ethics traditions is it's not just you and the big inchoate global phenomenon. There's this network of relationships and institutions. This is one of the things I love about Confucian ethics, that links you up with that bigger phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And you might not have if you think about a single individual who's going to stop the tide of climate change, nihilistic despair will result from that. But if you think I'm a single individual that's responsible for a series of relationships that instead take part in a bigger series of relationships that ultimately propagate butterfly effect style through the system, then I don't know if it gives you a strategy, but it at least gives you a bit of hope that your life makes a difference. I think another thing that I appreciate about these virtue traditions is, they're not brutally consequentialist. We talk about this a lot in our God and the Good Life course, but the thought that you should measure the significance of your life based on impersonal consequences that you cause out in the world versus the way that you develop on your path towards eudaimonia or to sagehood or to holiness. And one of the things that these traditions ask you to do is to also not measure your success or measure your moral responsibility based on just some single impersonal objective metric of the causal effect that you're having with your life, but instead ask, to what extent is your life made meaningful by the virtues and the actions that you undertake living in a world that's going through this very tragic kind of transition. And there's a way to be a good person in the midst of tragedy in virtue ethics, that I don't think there's a similar path for that. In ethical theories that just say you're only as good as the measurable external impact you're having with each particular choice.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much. When I was at Cornell pursuing PhD studies, one of my professors says, actually, if everyone is a Confucians, talk about their responsibility or prioritize their responsibility to their society, to their family, we will have a perfect democracy.
It might need 2,000 more years, 3,000 more years.
So right now, we give the time to the audiences, so feel free to pose questions for our fantastic philosophers here.
Thanks very much. This is a little more directed to you, Dr. Puett, but feel free to weigh in, Megan.
It's a trap.
I was intrigued by the term energy and this idea about happiness pulling out energy or producing energy, sort of negative emotions drawing away energy, and this idea that all these patterns that we're in some ways are just these sort of patterns that get traced back to this ebb and flow of energy. So my question now is just about when we identify a pattern we want to change. The question is kind of if the pattern exists because of this ebb and flow of energy, where does the energy come from then to change it? And I sort of wonder if there's is it just the case that perhaps there actually is a sort of reservoir of energy that we have that is untouched by patterns, or where does the energy become generated? And I can kind of see in the contemplative back and forth tradition that perhaps there's this process of discovering new forms of energy or releasing forms of energy that were latent there, but just we're now tapping into. Yeah, so I'm just curious if you have comments about that.
Absolutely, wonderful question. And the answer is yes. If we are learning to see the world as endless sets of energies, what we're also learning to recognize, because we need to see that this is the case, is that these energies are extraordinarily messy. That sounds bad, but it has a good side. Messy in the sense that they are absolutely uncontainable by any set of very stable habits and patterns. So we can fall into unbelievably static patterns that, again, can continue in our lives, and social organizations can continue for centuries, but luckily for everything, including us, there is so much more in the world of energies than that static pattern. And that's true of even us individually. So I may fall into static patterns that can sadly define much of my existence, but what I'm doing, getting to the heart of your question, when I'm cultivating myself is, and they'll even use powerful terminology here of, I'm refining my energies. And what you're doing when you're refining energies is the more refined energies are, the more responsive they are to the world, the less refined energies are, the less responsive. So think of mud, which is really turbid energy. So I can move mud, but mud doesn't respond on its own. I mean, it responds to my pushing it, but it can't alter and work with the world around it. Imagine air above us, hyper responsive. It's not, it's pure response. It's purely responsiveness. So what I'm doing if I'm cultivating myself is I'm becoming more refined. My energies literally are becoming more refined, which means I'm becoming more responsive to the world. If I'm more responsive to the world, that helps those around me bring out more refined elements in themselves. They become more responsive, and we become less like mud. We become less like these unresponsive things that are simply moved by things around us and then stuck there. If I put my shoe into a thing of mud, I push down in the mud, and then there it will be until someone else moves the mud in a different way. That's what we're like as humans, but if we're cultivating ourselves, we're becoming more refined, we're becoming more responsive. The more responsive we are, the more we are absolutely connected with things. Now, there'll still be unresponsive, in this way of thinking, less refined energies in the world. We want to be less like that and become more refined. So we're not creating more energy in the world, but we are creating is more refined energy in the world. We create a more responsive world, and the more responsive world is a world where ideally everything can truly flourish. Yeah, thank you.
More questions?
Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining us. I was wondering, I had never thought about this until I heard your presentations, but I was wondering about the conditions of production for these two ethical systems that you described, in the sense that I was very clear when you talk about the Plato, right? There is one model in which that is very well described in the Plato, in which you have an ethical system that is created here and now, right? And it cannot, and you can take it or leave it, but I am not, I will not be able to create it anywhere else, right? I cannot be a citizen anywhere else, and so I prefer to die rather than trying to take my system somewhere else, right? But then think about Confucius, right? That there is another possibility, which is, if you don't like me here, I will go somewhere else with my ideas, and if I find a patron, I will develop my ideas there. And if I'm kicked out, then I will go somewhere else. And so I was wondering, as I listened to these presentations, I was wondering, do you think that clearly there is a model in which we create ethical systems that are intransigent, in the sense that they cannot be portable, and then there is a model in which we create systems in which we can think of an exit, right? That we can take them somewhere else if we don't like them here. I was wondering if you can visualize any differences in what those conditions of possibility for the creation of these ethical systems would mean.
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous question. Well, one to start off, and I was reflecting on this morning as I was thinking about this event. Normally, the caricature of Confucian ethics is like it's the very, very rigid ethical system, and Socrates is like the free thinker. But in fact, you read the Crito, and Socrates is the very rigid. Like, outside of Athens, I have nothing. Like, I have nothing. And Confucius is like, yeah, you know, we'll move around and start a school of thought over here, and there'll be a school over here. It kind of depends on the teacher and student connection. So, and some of these caricatures also, you know, they don't hold up. I think that the question that you ask is one of the fundamental methodological questions of what I gestured at the end of my talk is like applied tradition, the practice of philosophers trying to argue with their traditions or mold their traditions and how far they're able to go. Some of this gets into a question of what your philosophy of tradition is. Like, what do you think makes something a tradition? Pickleball has a set of rules, and it's got a little bit of a history, and it's got a bunch of adherents and people that consider it a way of life, but it's not a full-blown tradition. We're not going to hire a philosopher of pickleball at the University of Notre Dame in the next century. Some things are too narrow or too small to count as traditions that are worth orienting a way of life around. They're below the radar of virtue ethics. Some things are also too big and diffuse. So one of the biggest fights in Western philosophy is whether philosophy itself constitutes a tradition, just like love of reason and pursuit of the truth. I'm of the mindset that like that's too vague. Even Socrates didn't believe that philosophy itself was a tradition worth adhering to. He felt he had other particular obligations and attachments that played into how he spent the last days of his life. So then it's like in the middle ground of like what's specific enough to constitute a tradition and how malleable and are those over time and how much can individuals shape the way that it moves. And this is where all of the action is. I think I'm probably of the more like progressive mindset on traditions where I think that individual philosophers, Socrates should have left Athens. He could have built his he could have formed new attachments and practiced his way of life somewhere else. I don't think that his scope of his options were as narrow as he perceived them to be. But there is an interesting question if you go too far off on your own, too far away from the institution, you don't have this sense of authority anymore. At what point have you kind of you've lost your moorings, you've lost your groundings? And in virtue ethics, that is the key question. Other ethical systems don't face this question of history the way that virtue ethics does in light of its view of human nature and human development and the meaning of human life. But the virtue ethical traditions do really face that. And at what point have you veered too far? That this is, it's where the debate has been.
Yeah, and very related answer when we jump to the classical Chinese tradition, but with an intriguing twist, because part of what's intriguing is when you look in the tradition, when people look back at moments when they see great things to have been happening. And the sense is always there are momentary pockets, like there are periods when enough of us can begin cultivating ourselves, we begin altering the world, we inspire others to do it, and we can create these moments where there really is flourishing. Now, they tend to be relatively short moments because humans, being humans, tend to fall back into patterns that they cease to change, and then you can go through, again, centuries of incredible stasis. But getting back to the heart of the question, if you look at those moments that they'll look back to, and different thinkers will look back to different moments, but the only thing that ties them together is what I just mentioned, right? It's when you get a few people beginning to cultivate themselves and then inspiring others to do it, and they begin connecting and creating better worlds. But the examples are, some will look back to a distant past before the emergence of the huge Bronze Age monarchies, and that was a moment that was obviously very different from a later moment that looked back to at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, which was very much a Bronze Age hereditary monarchy where everything is controlled by powerful aristocratic clans. And yet even in that context, the view is, well, but there were few people at the court who begin doing this, they inspire others peoples to do it, and yet, it's a totally different social organization. The implication being, if we now were to follow these teachings, by definition, we would be doing very different things. Now, there'd be some similarities. We would be, if we're following these ideas, inspiring each other to begin cultivating ourselves and connecting, and yet it would be economically, politically, a radically different world. It would involve some kind of rethinking of democratic institutions, rethinking of an economic system that was unlike anything that existed during the Bronze Age hereditary systems, and certainly prior to that, even more different, arguably. So there is no ideal-ism. There's no ideal form of a proper society. It's rather, since history is accumulative, what we will be doing at a certain moment in history will look totally unlike what would have worked 2,000 years ago and utterly unlike what might work 2,000 years from now. And we couldn't even predict what would work right now. It's a question you begin, going back to your key point, we begin with the cultivation, we begin with the education, the training, calling on others to do it, inspiring others to do it, and we'll begin altering the world in which we were born, which is always going to be a very different set of patterns than other humans at other moments of history have had to deal with. It's part of what I find powerful about the traditions. Again, it's refusal to give clear guidelines of what the proper society is. It gives you visions of the direction, but there's no final ism of what this would look like.
Thank you. More questions? Let me actually have a very concrete question, right? So talk about the freedom and the responsibilities. So I got a daughter who is 14 years old. So one day I asked her, I said, Julie, could you bring the dishes to the sink? Mom can wash it. Julie said, no, Mom, I have the freedom not to listen to you. So I was really shocked. And then that's reminding me during the COVID, right? So, we have so many protests that they have the freedom endowed by the Constitution not to wear the mask, right? So in those cases, I kind of feel I don't know how to respond, right? Not how to respond to my daughter who want to pursue her freedom in my household, or pursue, my neighbors who don't want to wear masks. Even my student says, I said, how about those people who are vulnerable to the virus, who are going to die? They said, that's their business. It's not my business. They are going to die. So how you respond to that, right? So very concrete from the philosophical.
There's this question, a question that I'm very interested in, and I kind of gestured it in the remarks, is Socrates' ideas about freedom and responsibility. They're both grounded in this more basic love that he feels for all of his fellow Athenians. Even the people that would kill him, he still feels a sense of love and connection towards them, and that's how he understands political responsibility. It's not even though he gestures at the social contract, it's not the case that he feels like he's part of this impersonal, rational contract like the Enlightenment thinkers. But he feels like it's a loving agreement that helped enable his growth. And I think when we look at the very fraught debates we had 5 years ago over public health, you also see this great absence of that sense of human-heartedness. Or I don't know about Julie. She's just 14. But there definitely seems to be some kind of ill in our modern, very diffuse, pluralistic, hyper-technological society that is preventing the cultivation of just this feeling of concern for others, even if we then have disputes about the actual ways to implement public health, just the hard-heartedness in which we seem to be going through the modern era, which in the Confucian tradition is called Ren, this idea of this feeling of warmth that you have towards just other members of your kind, or of your species. For Socrates, it would have been this kind of love that pushes him to have uncomfortable conversations even with total strangers. And that seems to be a virtue that's in short supply right now, that to my mind is a virtue that is the basis of forming any other virtues in the first place. It's that kind of love that causes you to trust your parents, which enables you to receive education from them, which enables you to cultivate other virtues down the road. And when our social structure prevents that virtue from developing, I think that we're in big trouble for the downstream for the rest of it. But
yes, And I very much agree. I think the key exactly at a larger social level, and even when dealing with a wonderful teenage daughter, the goal is very similar. It's to try to do what we can to help ourselves and those around us gain a sense of the degree to which we are absolutely constantly involved in relationships, and for those to work, it's all about, and as you said, the Confucian term is ren, the sense of just caring for those around us. And the key is to try to help people not think of, like, no, I'm the sovereign individual, I have rights, and therefore I'm not going to help you, but rather think of, well, no, we are involved in these relationships, and try to develop out of those relationships a sense of care. And so with Julie, I'd say it's, I don't mean to imply this would happen immediately or that she would immediately bring the dishes, but it's all about helping her really realize the degree to which, I'm kind of tired, I was working all day and now I'm doing the dishes, and if you bring them over to me, that will help me, and then I'll be done more quickly, and we can read together, and you're trying to give that sense of the degree to which her helping you allows you to help her, and that creates a tighter bond. That won't work immediately. I mean, she's a teenager, but it will work over time. And I'd say at a larger social level, it's much the same. Obviously, much more difficult, but it's much the same. It's a question of breaking down our tendency to see the world as these pure sovereign individuals who occasionally have to give up some of our rights to survive, and rather help to create a world where we are all based in relationships, and care is what needs to underlie those relationships. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. You develop your responsibility, sense of responsibility based on love, on our emotional, attachment to our parents, to our children, right? We start with that very, very stage, right, from your family. The Confucianism exactly said, adding virtue, start with the family, start with filial piety. Let's thank you for two fantastic speakers for the that conversation. We have receptions, simple receptions outside, so you will have time to enjoy individual conversation with our speakers or enjoy conversation with each other. It's outside. Thank you for coming. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah.